let's continue refactoring these ad hoc mesh creations into the entity classes. One of the things that we lost when we created the box is that these pieces of functionality that we were relying on tags and check collisions kind of belong to the box. So a box just happened to have these properties. But maybe you want to construct something with a box primitive that doesn't have these properties. So if we separate them out, then we'll only create these tags if these are stored as components. So when we create a primitive, we are creating them here, and maybe even this can be put as part of the class. We can create a static function to emit an event to create this type of thing. And so it might look like this. If we take this into the entity base, we can create, let's put static functions at the top, create mesh and static create emit entity create event. Now we can't use this because you've got to give it the, okay, so it's difficult to make a creation because you've got to pass in all the components that you want. Right? But if you had a components, this would be type, which is string, data, which is a value of any, and then an array of this. So you have components, and really that's the only thing that's missing. So if you supplied the components, oh, this is a type already. So we can do component, import from types, okay. Then up here we can use component. And this we can yep, let's import this. Event name created, and the type is, we don't know our type. So the static event is, so constructor is creating it from an event, but if you want to make a new event, then yeah, I guess you need to pass in the type. And the ID. Or the ID, you can create the type, name, components. So maybe, yeah, maybe you just have to emit it yourself. Meaning implement this static function in each individual one. Maybe it's not for the base class because the base class doesn't know anything about it. Okay. Not sure yet. Anyway, where were we? we have a grid entity incorrectly extends types of public components are incompatible. Oh, components here is going to need component. Just quick fix, import that, and then what? Cannot find name type. And the other one is the box entity also has a problem, so this becomes component. And that's okay now. Where did the problem? String number. Where's this? String or number array. Oh. Oh, let's look at type component. So you said it could be either of these things. Or can we just do this? Type of string data value any. Do that. And then in the entity base, we're good. No problems now. Okay. Okay, so back to Scene Manager. Yes, we wanted to add more components. Teleportable. So what kind of component might that be? That could be teleportable, true, collidable. So collidable means it's a wall. You can't go through it. Interactable, targetable means if you shoot it, it will go flying. So the benefit of having them as separate components is that you can just turn them on or off, add the component or remove the component, and if they were all tags, then you risk misspelling it, and it's harder to remove them without supplying the list of all the other components that you have. So we could supply this as a static function to say, these are the components I support. So you could implement this as default components. So we can go to entity base. Static, abstract static default components returns a list of components. TypeScript abstract static. Abstract class static. Abstract class config static or can I just do this? Static function implementation must be default components. So okay, this is making an error. Interface. Core interface can be any new implements config. Static core. Static members method don't work with inheritance. That's true to or not specific because all static properties belong to the class itself and not to the instances. Okay. Got it. A static method can be invoked if no instances of the class exist yet. Okay, I think maybe what I want is just a class method, but then this should be simplified. I can create an entity class that just takes the scene maybe, and then I can say build from event. I can do this, and then create this thing called build from event, because you'll have this event data. And that's where we do this stuff for. Cut, paste. And then, so we'll set all of these things. It has an ID, which is a string. It has a name, which is a string. It has components, which is component, list of components. And then for each of these, we'll set it like so. So this ID is ID, this name is name, this components is components. And what this will allow you to do is implement the abstract default components as a instance. Because then you can instantiate this and not necessarily build anything from it. You just want to use some of the methods in there. You could also instantiate it to emit. You could have abstract, or maybe not abstract, but emit create entity event now. Now you can implement that. Let's implement this emitter. So that's in primitives. And we can do something like, this is fine. So when you create an entity event, you can take an optional position to a Babylon vector 3 and rotation, which can be a Babylon quaternion. And they can both be optional. So this one will just be No, I don't think we will take it. We'll take it from the default components because we need to override that anyway. So we can take the camera orientation into consideration. Okay, so the name will be this type. Which it doesn't need to be a function, it could just be a thing, right? So you can just say you have a type, right? Public type. And it's a string. And what is this? Yeah, duplicate identifier. Yeah, let's get rid of the function. There's no reason to make this a function. So the constructor this constructor should take a type. So you'll take the public type. This way. Bring this in from utils. Bring this in from where did you get that? That's from Scene Manager. UID. No. From Prims. This thing. Copy. Paste. Components will be this default components, which is already a list. This will be a list. You don't need to do exceptions like this. You don't need to do data massaging like this. We'll just say this event, import event from types. So the type will be this type. Oh, can't do that. Type will be this type. UID will be that. Name will be name. Components will be components. Will be default components. Components will be this default components. Okay, so that will do it. Okay, so then, so now let's see about box entity. It doesn't implement the default components. So we can also have a default components, but default components returns that. So we're going to say that primitives actually does this thing here. So we can put that on the entity base as a default components. So first we have some data, 0 of all these things, and then we have a forward vector gets the direction, scale, and place. Asset position should be around this place, and then the data position would be like this. Default component as object. How about that? So it has this, and then we normally override the position with this. So position equals asset position as array, and then you do that. So you didn't even need this. So you're overriding it. So you have rotation, scaling, and then data, which is add position, and then asset position as array, and then we rounded it and return this as an object. So then in the box entity, we can just use primitives had another method, right? So we said default components, and then they did this component object to list. So we can use that as a tool in entity base. Component object to list. And we just do this component list with, and you give it the component object which is any. So if we return this, this returns a list of component. And what's this red thing over here? This type. So let's move this editable out. Editable should be a property of the components. So we'll do that, and we'll also move this out. This doesn't have to do with setting attributes, so we'll do this. Okay, back to box entity. And now we need to supply a type and a scene, so we'll set our own type. Actually, you can just say that this is box and it will be set. And this thing doesn't need that many things either. You can just give it the scene. Default components. Doesn't really need any default components. You can just say return this component object to list from this default component as object. Actually, you can just implement it and then only override it if you need to, right? So this can be the default implementation. Copy this to entity base. Default components is this. Yep. And then in box entity, we can override it if we want. That's a default implementation, same as that. Type, we don't need. Create mesh is fine. Okay, grid entity. Same thing, we don't need any of this. The type is grid. I'm going to create the mesh. That's fine. Oh, wait. To support that, default components. Can we do... Okay, so we need to borrow some components here. So we'll get this default components as object. Let what is this? Component object. And let comp object dot Well, box, let's say, is collidable. Or just collisions. How about collide true? And editable true. Targetable true. And then you can send these to this component object to list with this component object, and then return this. So box will have some other properties. So in the scene manager, we were creating a box. There was teleportable, interactable, targetable. And some of these things, right? Go back to box. So, come on, object. Teleportable. How about just floor? Floor. It's true. Interactable. I don't like how these are strings. That's fine, I guess. Okay, so we added a bunch of these things. Right, this is just going to take the scene now. And now we'll do build from event. Which takes that. And build from event. How about build mesh from event? And and then always return the mesh. Do the same thing down here for the grid. So this will be grid entity, and then don't need this, and then at the top, mesh will always be mesh. Entity, box entity. Okay, so we got a lot more events, and a lot more components now. Alright, these both render. And if I inspect the components, actually, okay, go to the primitives where you create it. So we're going blah, blah, blah. So we'll do something special for box. If prim, if prim is box, we'll do something special and then return. And so we need to say let box equal new box entity. Now box, we will emit this, and does it need anything else? It has all the defaults. So if you look, it'll create its own name UUID, populate that, and it'll get its own default components. And default components comes from box entity default components, which we'll get from the scene. Yeah, seems fine. The delete seems to be broken, so what if I say box? Okay. And does transform work? No, I think this menu might just be broken. Okay. Tell me about this box here. So if we go to the GraphQL, tell me about entities, and tell me about the ID, the type, and the name, and the components. List the type and the data. Here we've got ID, grid, scaling, rotation, position. Very good. box. There's the old box, new box, collide true, editable true, floor true. Okay. Position, rotation, scaling, targetable. Yep, it's all in there. Now, should a grid actually be a plane? Because if you look at the grid, it's rotated. There's no editable properties about how narrow or long. But maybe grid is just like that. Don't apply color to it. Okay? Okay, let's take a break here.